All right, everyone, we will come back together for our next panel here at our conference. So thank you so much for returning to your seats and wrapping up these delightfully interesting conversations. We just shared with you a lot of evidence about the state of civil society in Wisconsin. Now we're going to talk about civil discourse in uncivil times and its implications for civic renewal. We have a group of outstanding scholars to present their work. They'll each present for around 15 minutes. We'll hope to have a little bit of time to bring them all up then to the stage for a brief conversation and some reflections on each other's work. First out of the gate, we have Professor Beth Tice Morse, who is at the University of Nebraska. Beth is a prolific and widely cited political scientist who is also an amazing teacher and a fantastic colleague. I had the pleasure of working with Beth for 5 years on the faculty of the University of Nebraska. We continue to co-author Political Behavior in American Elections together, but that is not her best book. She is also the co-author of Congress as Public Enemy, an award-winning book from the APSA, Stealth Democracy, an award-winning book from the APSA, Who Counts as an American, an award-winning book from the APSA, and her new book project, which she'll share a lot with us right now. So please welcome an outstanding scholar who cares deeply about the issues we're talking about today, the wonderful Beth Tice Morse.
So thank you so much. I want to start, of course, by thanking Mike and Devon and for this tremendous opportunity here today. And I also had such a great time last night at dinner talking to the students here, so thank you so much. It was just fantastic, so thank you so much. So my talk today is going to be based on a book that I have written with a friend of mine, Jeff Spinner-Halev, who is at the University of North Carolina. And Jeff is a political theorist, and I am a political psychologist. So we're bringing people who come at questions from a very different perspective, and I found it very, very renewing. It was just a tremendous amount of fun. So our book is called Respect and Loathing in American Democracy. And we're interested in the concept of respect. So what I'm going to be talking about today is this, but I am going to very quickly go over the definition of respect and what we mean by it, and get into some of the results from our research. So I think the first question that we should ask, and I get this a lot when I tell people I study respect, is they say, well, why should we respect those jerks? And we get so much pushback. I can't even begin to tell you how much pushback we get. And I understand the pushback. I get it. I mean, I have written on tolerance in my past, and I understand tolerance and the need to give people their civil liberties rights. But respect is something different. And so I think we do need to motivate why we think people ought to respect each other. So I am going to talk primarily today about civic respect, but we talk a lot in our book about what we call recognition respect. And recognition respect, we argue, is fundamental to democracy. If we are going to have democratic equality, which I think we in a democracy must believe in democratic equality, we need to be willing to recognize people's intrinsic worth, that people are agents in a democratic political system, and we need to respect that agency, even if we disagree with them. And so we consider recognition respect a universal. Everybody should respect everyone, no matter what they have done. I'm not going to talk about recognition respect, though. I'm going to talk about civic respect, which is our second kind of respect. And civic respect is basically the idea that we need to be willing to listen to and engage with other people, even in the face of disagreement. We need to be willing to hear people out. We don't have to agree with them. In fact, we could mightily disagree with them, but we should listen to them and hear what they have to say. And so what I want to do today is to talk about that civic respect And we break civic respect into 3 different areas. I am going to focus mostly on the first one, interpersonal and impersonal respect, but I'll briefly mention the other 2 as well because I think they're important to understanding how we envision this idea of civic respect. So we did 27 focus groups, which is way too many focus groups. We did 27 focus groups, 3 surveys, and 2 experiments to try to get at these ideas of respect. And in our discussions with our focus group participants, there were a lot of people who mentioned this idea that their interpersonal relationships were harmed by the 2016 election. We did the first set of focus groups starting in 2018. And this is just one example of a participant whose his wife's relationship with her sister was just ruined, right? It just fell apart. We also asked survey questions, though, about this ending of relationship, and this mimics well what Mike was talking about earlier. We asked people about whether they had argued with somebody because of the election of Donald Trump, stopped talking to them, blocked on social media, or ended a relationship with these people. Now, these numbers, these percentages, you might think, oh, that's not that bad. I mean, my goodness, what, 10%? You know, no big deal. We can live with that. But if you think that, you know, what, 60-some million people voted for Hillary Clinton, 60-some million voted for Donald Trump, this is a lot of people. This is a lot of people who are ending relationships and just cutting this off. In our argument, this is an example of a lack of civic respect. We don't think that you should cut off relationships with people, and I'll talk at the end about the solutions that I hopefully might have for this. It's also the case, just as Mike found, that Democrats, or Clinton voters in this case, had a harder time keeping relationships going than Trump voters. We also asked people, though, a series of questions directly about civic respect. And one was this kind of general, you know, do you believe that you should listen to and engage with people with whom you disagree? Yeah, of course, everybody says yes. But then we asked specifically about opposing partisans. Do you think that should Democrats have to listen to Republicans? Should Republicans have to listen to Democrats? And we see the number in like the 50 to 60 range saying yes. And then we asked about the percent of people who agreed with the idea that they should engage with. So one is listening to, and one is actually engaging with. Get together with people with whom you disagree. Actually enjoy that idea of talking to people with whom you disagree. And you can see that the numbers then, in terms of engagement, drops. Now, this was asking about kind of these general, would you talk to a Democrat? The first series of questions is about family, and it seems true that dealing with family who disagrees with you is harder for people than this interpersonal respect dealing with strangers. But we thought, okay, there are a lot of different ways to engage with and listen to the other side's point of view. And maybe we need to give that a shot. You know, maybe it is the idea of talking to somebody that we find especially difficult. And so maybe what we need to introduce here is this idea of impersonal respect, which is that I can try to figure out where your side is coming from by watching your news, by reading a blog, by reading a newspaper article from your side of from the spectrum, and maybe that impersonal side of things will actually be more appealing to people. Maybe people will be able to do that. So we did an experiment, and this was in 2021. And the experiment was that we had people read a series of 5 statements that takes a certain position on an issue. The control group was about the health benefits of hiking, okay? But then there were 4 political ones, 2 on social justice, 1 pro and 1 con on social justice, and 2 on national solidarity, 1 pro, 1 con, and people were randomly assigned to one of these 5 conditions. So people read the statements, and then they were asked how much they agree with what they have just read. After they finished that, they were told, again, randomly assigned. Some people randomly assigned to the interpersonal condition, some to the impersonal condition. We said in the interpersonal condition, we have a panel of people who are available to talk to you, and one of them will be able to talk to you after the survey. So when you finish the survey, would you be interested in talking to somebody about this topic that you've just read about from that point of view? In the impersonal condition, people were told at the end of the survey, you will have an opportunity to link to some articles that take this point of view, and you can read more about it. You know, are you interested in reading more about it? So what we wanted to see, obviously, was whether people are willing, actually, when they're actually asked to do this, are they willing to either talk to somebody or to read something? So the results, obviously, people like hiking. There aren't a lot of people who are opposed to hiking. But it's interesting to me that you can already see the difference between interpersonal and impersonal. People don't want to talk to a stranger. So the green line is the impersonal, the orange is the interpersonal, and people just aren't that comfortable talking to a complete stranger. I get it, you know, yep, I understand. When people agreed with the topic that they had just read about, we see a fair amount of willingness to engage with the ideas, right? So let's say you read about social justice and it's a pro-social justice position, and then you are more likely to say, well, yeah, of course, I'd love to read more on this. You know, I agree with it. Why wouldn't I? But impersonally, fewer people do, and so we see a fairly extreme drop. But we also had people who disagreed with what they read. And when we look at that, we get this. People just don't want to engage with people personally or even read. I was shocked, actually, that these were the same. I was actually shocked. I thought people would be more willing to say they'd read an article, and they weren't. So what this suggests is the earlier numbers that I showed you, where people are asked, would you be willing to talk to and engage with people from the other party? And people said, oh, yeah, of course I would. When actually asked to do it, they won't do it. So this is a lack of civic respect. I think we need to be willing to engage with and listen to the other side, okay? So we also have two other areas that we think are important facets of civic respect. And one is the idea of partisan stereotyping. And I'm not going to show any data on this at all, but I want it to be clear, and we have data supporting this, that not all Democrats are communists and not all Republicans are fascists. Neither are all Democrats intolerant and not all Republicans are racist. They just aren't. And I think what happens when we politically stereotype the other side, we assume what they believe, we assume what they are going to say, and then we completely bar them from saying anything. We are moving forward in our world with a misunderstanding. We are moving forward based on our partisan stereotypes. So the other area that we talk about a lot is accepting pluralism. And it used to be when I was in grad school a long time ago, we talked about pluralism all the time, and we just don't really talk about pluralism much, and I think we have to. And so one thing we wanted to figure out is just basically how open are people to the idea that there are multiple, we have two-party system in our country. There is another party that has, that runs for elections. We have multiple issue stands in our country. We have multiple ways of seeing things, and we need to embrace that. We need to accept that. To me, in this table, what I find the most disturbing is this column here, this one right here. So the question, so what we said to people, there's no good reason to vote for the opposing party. So when Democrats were asked, there's no good reason to vote for Republicans, and Republicans asked about Democrats. And I find it astonishing that about 50% can think of no good reason to vote for the other party. What we often found was that people said that the other side voted the way they did because they were misinformed. They just were ignorant. They don't know what they're talking about. They're misled by the media. they're just told, they just don't know what they're doing and they're misled by the media, or that they are following others without thinking, right? Well, if you think that people are only voting the way they do because they're dumb or misinformed or misled, you are just taking away any sense of agency from them. They are probably voting for a reason, and it's probably not because they're just dumb. So basically, we argue that pluralism is an essential component of this. So then what can we do to increase civic respect? Trying to figure out solutions is a hard thing. And so I'm going to throw out a couple of solutions, and then I'll let you go. So obviously, one solution to the lack of civic respect that is rampant in our country today is that affective polarization is so strong. We hate the other side so much that maybe if we decrease affective polarization, we will get closer to being able to have civic respect for each other. I think this is obviously the case. I do think that if we had less affective polarization, if people hated each other less, we would be able to get along better and people would respect each other. Having said that, however, a lot of the things that I have read on efforts to try to decrease affective polarization have really focused on the idea of having a moderator, a trained moderator, who is involved in leading those discussions, having a very set context within those discussions take place. And I can't help but think that most of us, if we are interacting with people who disagree with us, it's not in those safe spaces, right? It's not in those really choreographed spaces. And so I'm less optimistic that this can work. I just am not certain about it. But I said before that I really think we need to focus more on pluralism and teaching pluralism. We do a lot in our educational system to teach about racial and ethnic diversity, and even in some ways to teach about gender diversity. At least there's an attempt to try to do more of that. What I don't think we do a lot of is teaching about political diversity. And I think we need to do more of that in schools. It's scary. Teachers don't really want to bring up political issues because it's a frightening thing. But I think the only way we can really have an understanding of pluralism is to have students jump in with both feet and talk about politics and understand that this person sitting across from them in the room has a reason for why they think what they think. I just think, I can still disagree completely with them, but it's good to understand that they're not some ignorant, misled person who's saying these things, for no reason. I think that has to start with younger people. So I think we need to start in our education system. I think in college we need to try to do better in terms of getting people to talk. And then the last piece of advice I'm going to give, and sorry for putting up my Husker fandom here, given who Wisconsin plays tomorrow. But anyway, one thing that Jeff and I argue in our book is that politics has in a lot of ways become just much too important to us. And it subsumes a lot of us, not everybody, but it really becomes the driving force in a lot of our lives in a way that almost everything we do gets interpreted through a political lens. And I think we need to step back from that. I think that we need to pay less, I hate to say this because I'm a political scientist, but I think we need to pay less attention to politics, or at least be willing to step back from it and not have it really drive how we see the world around us. And that is not easy, but I think we could get along better with people if we put politics to the wayside. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Beth for that provocative and fascinating talk. Can't wait for this book to come out and read it, loan it to a student, and never see it again. I'm looking at many of you. Our next presenter, Danielle Brown of the University of Minnesota, is a fantastic scholar who has written voluminously about police violence and protests, news coverage of protests, how we think about race in the news media's contribution to the debatability of racism itself. People who are academic nerds know about news coverage of social protests and know that a lot of the work that guides our understanding of that was done right here at UW with Doug McLeod, our friend and colleague. And when I asked Doug, like, who's doing the most interesting work today about news coverage of social protests, without hesitation, Danny Brown. And so we're so excited to have Professor Brown, who not only has published a ton of work on this, but is also the Lillian Lodge Copenhagen Early Career Scholar of the Year from 2020, and won the Emerging Scholars Award from the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication in 2017 and 2018. So that was 5 years ago, so she's emerged, no longer emerging, and we're delighted to have Professor Brown with us here today.
All right, thank you so much for being here today and for inviting me. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. Typically, when I give talks, I try to brand myself as a pessimist so you don't get disappointed at the end that I don't have a happy ending. But I've been reflecting a lot. And I decided a long time ago, when I was trying to figure out what I was going to say here, that I would rebrand myself as, are you ready? An optimistic realist who regularly gets disappointed by the world. Also known as a Pisces. So I'm actually not going to make you wait any longer for this really exciting talk. And hopefully it lifts up at the bottom. So my work has focused primarily on the dynamic stability of racism, what I call the dynamic stability of racism in news media. So the news media patterns and the coverage that's been created, especially in the mainstream, has not represented communities of color, marginalized populations well for a really, really long time. When it comes to racism and racist systems, we know is that there are some things that have changed over time. So yes, since the Kerner Commission, things are very different in the news. Are they necessarily better and more beneficial for communities of color? Not really. And so I call this the dynamic stability because there are highs and lows, but for the most part, we stay pretty stable in terms of what our media narratives do for those marginalized communities. I've done that in health and in protest coverage. And today I just want to focus a little bit on protest coverage, what that looks like, how it's evolved over time so that you can kind of understand how stable it is. And then talk to you a little bit about the LIFT project, which is the project that I am currently doing right now that focuses on Black communities and trying to find new ways, new solutions for trying to undercut this problem. So the protest paradigm, again, this began right here in Wisconsin. And it basically, if I had to sum up my 10 years worth of work on this in one slide, which I do quite often, it's depressing, is that the news media focuses more on these delegitimizing narratives. So that would be the focus on riots, on arrests, on confrontations with others, on the spectacle of individuals, and less often on legitimizing narratives. So literally what the protesters are there for. I'm not just talking about the death of someone, right? Like the bigger systematic problems that are connected with a potential police violence death or with a sexual harassment case against an individual woman. So really the power systems that are bred behind them. And the press tends to focus more often on these delegitimizing narratives and these legitimizing narratives, and the core of the theory says that that is a problem for the public, right? And it presents these social movements in a way that that makes the public not support them. We also know that it does things to the communities that it marginalizes, right? This focus on the delegitimizing side of things. And it affects trust and how people want to engage with the news. This is how we got alternative media networks in the first place. Oh, I went the wrong way on the thing. Okay. So for the most part, I have done this since 2014, or looked at this since 2014. I started actually in 2013 looking at the coverage of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, a comparative study looking at the 2 years, and found that for Black Lives Matter protests, they were overrepresented as violent and underrepresented were their demands and grievances, the reasons why they were there. then did that again in covering the 2018 killing of Stephon Clark in Sacramento, California. I started this well before 2020 and was really thinking that Stephon's death was the marker that was going to create this racial reckoning that we saw before. What I found very quickly was that it wasn't. Again, in this coverage of Stephon's murder and of the protests that followed, there was an overrepresentation of Black Lives Matter, not as riotous, but instead as disruptive. So they stopped an NBA game, and that was like the end of the world. That was covered excessively, and then there's an underrepresentation again of the demands and the agendas. There's also a ton of episodic framing, so thinking about things in terms of, well, Stephon Clark was killed, instead of connecting that to a broader system of policing that has killed many Black people. But in 2020, we reckoned, right? So after the death of, or murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, there was an opportunity, or news organizations, many of them, many organizations generally around the United States and world, said that they were going to think about, at least, and find ways to engage with a system that that's racist undertones are being very elevated at the moment. And so what we know is that many news organizations did promise to do something. And the protests at that time are still in need of mainstream media coverage. We know that it actually gets more complicated than mainstream media, though, right? There's partisan politics, there's everything on the internet, there's all the things on social media. And we also know that in 2020 was the first time and the only time we've ever seen super dramatic shifts in public opinion towards support for Black Lives Matter, which would indicate by the theory that our coverage is actually better in 2020. We actually did an analysis of this. We did an analysis of headlines from AP, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, so tried to bring in the most watched or most circulated news to look at what narratives were focused on most often, just in the headlines. This is part of an article that you can scan there called The Reckoning for the Right in Political Communication. We coded for how protesters were presented, so the violence of protesters, their confrontations with police or their arrests, how peaceful they were, so on the legitimizing side, how peaceful they were, and when their substance and effectiveness showed up in the headlines. We also looked for things that don't normally show up. That we had looked for years, and they didn't show up, and we're quantitative scholars in many of my team's initiatives, and so we can't do things with all zeros. And so how often is the news coverage talking about police violence during the protest? How often are they talking about counter groups that are engaging in these protests or agitators? So we look for that as well. This is the less depressing part, so just mark my words that, see, I'm an optimist, yes. You will see here that there is a small uptick, as in it's not zero, focus on police violence and on anti-Black Lives Matter demonstrator violence, about how other people are engaging with these protests and with these demonstrations. You can see that Fox News deflates that, the importance of that more often, as you might expect, and MSNBC inflates it as more important just through the sheer number of or amount of coverage. But Fox is significantly less than the other news organizations. And then here is just those broader categories. The top two categories there are delegitimizing narratives, so violence and confrontation police. And the bottom two narratives are legitimizing narratives, the peacefulness of the protesters and the substance and effectiveness of the protesters. You can see that everybody but MSNBC aligns with the paradigm, right? Everybody but MSNBC is focusing more on delegitimizing narratives than legitimizing narratives in their headlines there. Fox is extreme. Fox is extreme because not only are they the most adherent to this protest paradigm, they're also publishing 3 times more coverage than MSNBC is publishing. So they're inflating, they're wiping through the internet with these sort of imbalanced narratives, not sort of imbalanced narratives, definitely imbalanced narratives that are not giving protesters really the democratic and political weight that they deserve as a function in our democracy. So that's the depressing part. Right. We went on to find that how people encounter some of this information affects them differently, as like you've heard from others this morning. But what I also knew is that I had never, in the decade that I had worked, been on ground zero when I was doing this work. I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota in June, the first week of June in 2020. So just a week after George Floyd was murdered. It was a really fun experience, again, the optimist coming out in me. And what I found was that I had the experience for the first time to be on the ground with journalists for an extended amount of time to see the process they went through to create the coverage that they had. One, I won't play this because this isn't a PDF, but one of the journalists that I got to talk to was Jared Henderson, and I got to sort of follow and understand some of the processes that he had to go to just make small edits, to just make small moves in the documentary that he was facing. So one of the fights that he told me about after he while he was putting this particular documentary together was about not using the actual death of George Floyd in the video, which is cut out here. Now, there's pieces of George Floyd's encounters with police in the video, but there's not a full scene. You don't have to watch him die or be dead. And so that was a small fight. This is something my stats actually can't account for, right? I can't say that journalists are doing better or that the mainstream is doing better based on the way that I've been counting for all of this time. Plus, my sheer experience of just seeing journalists on the ground and what they are going through made me realize I need to do something different, not just qualitative, but different. I also talked with DEI managers that were hired in newsrooms. So one of the key components of the reckoning was that there were many DEI editors that were placed into newsrooms. Usually, they were elevated from the bottom up. Talked with over 15 of these DEI managers and journalists, just to see what kind of progress they were able to make, and got to hear the stories of the tiny little battles that have been won since 2020. So when I think about how I presented the stats for a very long time, yes, the mainstream media has numerically inflated the conflict and controversy connected to protest, especially racial justice protest. But also in newsrooms and with journalists, there are people who are fighting, right? And they're really putting up a fight to try to make more balanced coverage that reflects communities, coverage that's more robust. So that makes me want to say this isn't just a misrepresentation problem, right? I've actually found on the smaller case studies that I've been working on that the patterns flip sometimes a little bit, or they get closer to flipping. And so what I know is that this has harmed Black communities on a regular basis. The representation of protest in this way, of racial justice protest, has continued to harm Black communities because of the sheer number patterns, the sheer emphasis on more delegitimizing narratives. But that harm is a legacy, right? It's not that there isn't good journalism out there. There is. There are amazing, in-depth, can't be produced at the level that Fox News can produce 215 articles about the same thing. There's amazing journalism out there that is trying to change the narrative and is trying to put out quality narratives about communities. So when I was thinking about what do we do with this legacy of harm, right? How do we fix this? Where do we go forward? What's the solution to any of it if we just keep doing it? For a long time, I thought that was go into newsrooms and try to shake things up. I did that a lot. I know there are other people doing that now. It didn't really seem to change any of the patterns drastically that I wanted to see, but I could find the one-offs. One of the things that my work focuses on now is how do we think about repairing the trust, the harm that's been created for communities of color, for marginalized communities, so specifically Black communities in this particular project. We know that one of the core problems with the protest paradigm and with other misrepresentation issues that are connected, especially the misrepresentation issues that are connected with representation issues in crime, that many of those make people want to disconnect from news, and they've changed the way that they trust news organizations. So we asked Black communities, who do you trust then? And this is a survey that we launched in June and July 2022. It is mostly Minneapolis, St. Paul, Madison, and Detroit Black Americans. Actually heavy on the Detroit and Wisconsin. But we launched a survey to see what Black Midwesterners thought about trust. Who do they trust? When do they trust? And one of the most interesting things that we found here is that you can see, oops, this just quit working totally, so I'm going to go over here. So you can see that there's a lot of trust sort of focused extensively on local Black journalists and healthcare providers. Local Black journalists actually almost always win in terms of their amount of trust for other people. They're right up there at the top. And what's most interesting is if you look at the difference between these individuals and the trust in local news, right? These local Black journalists are in these local newsrooms. It's the individuals that they trust, not the institution. I did another survey that looks very closely just at Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the core of this research is being conducted right now. And here you can see, again, at the very, very top, a overwhelming trust, or an overwhelming amount of trust, in local Black journalists, again, the top ones. So we have an opportunity here to re-engage Black communities. We have an opportunity here to still see where there's a connection between Black communities and news organizations. We asked them, which Black journalists do you like the most? Which do you trust the most, right? And Gail King came up number one. Don Lemon is a household favorite as well. But do you know who the number one trusted journalist was that was named in this survey? I'll give you a guess. I find this super interesting because Trevor Noah is the number one most trusted journalist named in this survey. He is also part of an institution but doesn't have another institution behind him. It's another individual, right? So it's another Black person they're seeing deliver news, whether you think it's funny or not, right? But they're seeing one individual deliver news and they trust that individual. So the remainder of my research is looking more into those Black journalists as a potential vehicle for creating more trust with Black communities, and even if it's not creating trust with media organizations directly, creating trust within communities, with each other, within narratives, about information that might help protect them. We also see, which is really reflective of the Wisconsin data, that self is among the most trusted person that is named on a regular basis. So we asked, write the person you trust the most to provide you with important information, and it's self, a family member, and God are the people that they would rely on the most in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis, St. Paul, opposed to other places in the Midwest, also has a higher faith or a higher trust rate in faith leaders, which is another aspect of the LIFT project that we are continuing to explore, but I won't present here today. So when I think about trust and trust deficits and how the media coverage has harmed other communities, I think this is expandable to other communities that feel marginalized, right? There's a narrative that they feel like has not represented them well. And for many people, it hasn't represented them well. That has harmed their community in a way that is tangible, and they've disconnected from the news. In a lot of ways, we talk about that as there's a trust deficit, right? But I don't think it's a trust deficit. I think it's displaced. We've moved that trust to a different place, and I think part of our solution making has to be about going and trying to figure out where it is, right? Where does the trust exist? And how can we utilize those connections to bring information back into them? My work does not center capitalist strategies to make people come back to the newsroom or to make people come back to subscription models, which makes it less fun for some people. But for me, it is a kind of an anti-racist solution for thinking about ways that we can re-engage communities that are not going to engage because we've given them a legacy of hurt. We've done a legacy of harm to their communities, to their histories, to generations of their families. So just in closing, will say that the mainstream media news' reinforcement of racial hierarchies that harm Black communities contributes to this idea of trust displacement. And nothing about what we do, about individual tiny little changes and norms, which is probably going to fix the problem. I've been, again, so focused on trying to change. What if we change the narratives? What if you focused more on this balance than that balance? Can people see it? My survey results suggest probably not. Like, it's going to be really hard to see. It just takes one mess up, just one mistake to go viral and to mess up trust again. So I invite you and other researchers to think about who the trusted messengers are in communities. They may not be family in Wisconsin, but there may be individuals in communities that are able to deliver news that can be new vessels for information giving for communities, and we can still fulfill the democratic goals that are needed to keep people informed, safe, and involved in our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Our next presenter is Professor Yiftach Lelkes of the University of Pennsylvania. Yift studies the structure, dynamics, and causes of political attitudes, especially focusing on polarization in American politics, where he co-directs a polarization research lab. He has published widely in the top journals in both mass communication, or not both, in mass communication, political science, and psychology, and so an interdisciplinary scholar to help us root through and think about these really important issues related to affective polarization in the United States. You heard Beth talk a bit about affective polarization earlier, and that is part of YIF's research agenda at the University of Pennsylvania. A very accomplished scholar, a good person, and with Wisconsin ties, so always nice to bring YIF back to our campus. So thank you so much, and please welcome Professor Yiftach Lelkes.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great being back. I am from here. I went to school here. So whatever's been going on in Wisconsin, it hits close to home. And I promise that by the end of the day, my accent will come back full force, and my wife and children will be in for a surprise. So while Beth was talking, I was nodding vigorously because I think a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is related to her kind of prescriptions for how to save democracy, or at least partly. So this is work with two graduate students, Nick Diaz, who is a PhD student at UPenn, and Jake Pearl, who was a graduate student. He's now a data scientist in industry and now buys me lunch. So, that's how it goes. Before I start, though, I wanted to kind of take the moment to hawk what we're doing. For the past couple months, we've been focused on this polarization research lab. I'm doing this with Sean Westwood at Dartmouth and Chantal Yengar at Stanford. We're doing a bunch of stuff, but we're very focused on creating a public good. We've been studying polarization for a while, and we turn it into a bunch of different projects, but one of maybe the biggest project is this weekly survey that we ask 1,000 people questions about their attitudes towards democracy, affective polarization, like how much they like each party, perceptions and whatnot. And we can do lots of cool stuff with that, but those questions take about 5 minutes. We're left with about 10 minutes of survey time, which we're now opening up to the broader community. So, if you're a researcher, please apply. If you're a practitioner and you have an idea you want to test for reducing polarization, please apply. And we put our data, your data is your data, but we put the core data out there immediately. And we have this annual meeting that, again, please apply. One of the cool things we could do with this data is, because we ask so many people over time, we can start looking at subnational levels of these measures. So this is a map of affective polarization, so the difference in how I feel towards my party minus how I feel towards the out party. And we created this map using this technique, multi-level regression in post-stratification. And you can do this with any of our measures, but this is just effective polarization. As you see, Wisconsin is pretty polarized. In fact, if you kind of rank order these in the most to least polarized, Wisconsin is, according to our measure, the third most effectively polarized state in the country, after two other swing states, Arizona and Nevada, and right before two other swing states, Florida and Michigan. So, this kind of hints pretty strongly at political competition being a driver of polarization. But that isn't, well, I do believe that structures, institutions are maybe the main force of polarization. I do think that bottom-up forces, psychology also matters. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, about kind of how perceptions affected polarization and looking at perceptions and misperceptions. So it's undoubtedly true that people tend to dislike people who they disagree with. So if I tell you if I am a Democrat and you tell me you're pro-life, I will probably dislike you. If I am a Republican and you tell me that you're pro-choice, I will probably dislike you. There's lots of data showing these different experiments. Why this is the case is kind of up for debate, but it's an empirical fact that we dislike those with whom we had disagreements with. So the issue with this is that we have a totally warped perception of what the other side thinks. So we have totally skewed perceptions of what other Democrats think or what other Republicans think. And these misperceptions are driving our own attitudes and our own behavior. So to show you an example, this is data from the American National Election Study. And this is one question, but you could do this with any of the questions that are framed this way, where they ask people to place themselves, and then the average Democrat and the average Republican on a scale, usually from most liberal to most conservative. This is a question about should the government guarantee jobs and a standard of living or not. So we now have three measures. Where do people place themselves? Where do they see other Democrats? And where do they see other Republicans? From this, you can calculate actual differences, where Democrats and Republicans actually stand, and perceived differences. And what you see is that this here is the difference in actual stances. So where Democrats and Republicans actually stand, it's about a 1-point difference on these scales. But this is where the perceived differences are. And you see in the dotted are the perceived differences among Democrats, how they perceive Democrats and Republicans, and how Republicans perceive Democrats and Republicans. And you see that the perception gap is about twice as big as the actual gap. So again, people dislike those with whom they disagree, but they are wrong about how much they actually disagree. And there's lots of data showing that these misperceptions are driving all sorts of bad stuff. And if you correct these misperceptions, it leads people to support more democratic behavior. It reduces polarization. It leads to good stuff. So I don't have qualms with this data, but I think it's limited in one way, in that it's almost entirely focused on means, right? Where does the average Democrat stand? Where does the average Republican stand? And what Beth was talking about a lot, which I was excited to hear, was about diversity, that there's a lot of variance. There's a lot of Democrats who believe different things, a lot of Republicans who believe different things. So this is that same question. The dots are where Democrats actually stand, and where, if I can find this, this is where Republicans actually stand, and this is the distribution. And you see that there are far left Democrats, there are far right Democrats, there are far left Republicans, there are far right Republicans. But all this work is only focused on where do you think the mean person is. And I think thinking about heterogeneity, thinking about group diversity may matter. And I'll tell you why for a couple of reasons. One is that if you see a group as all similar then they're all equally dislikable. But if you see some diversity of interest, if you see that there are people in the party who may be less extreme, you think maybe there's a chance I can compromise with them. So that's one reason. Another reason is that a lot of this affected polarization work is based on the notion that if I know that you're a Republican, I can assume all this stuff about you. And I can assume that you believe this, that you live here, that you voted this way. But if there's actually outgroup heterogeneity, these cues become non-diagnostic. They're less useful. And they can no longer serve as a useful guide for behavior. So much of this work so far is about measurement and seeing like how do people perceive the diversity of each group? And how does this compare to perceptions of extremity? And then I'll talk about, do these misperceptions move the needle? I started with 60 slides yesterday, but I've cut it down quite a bit. So this is what we're left with. Study one. So what we did is we took a sample of people and we randomly assigned them to one of three issues. They were asked about abortion, immigration, or gun rights, and they were asked to place themselves first on this scale, just like that ANES question. Then the next thing we did is we asked them to draw distributions for Democrats and Republicans. You can ignore this. This is not useful, actually. So this is how we ask people to draw distributions. We assume that most Americans don't have a good sense of histograms and density plots, so we asked them to just drop tokens. And so if the people were asked this for both Democrats and Republicans, and they were told, okay, imagine you have tokens and each one represents a Democrat. And this is the scale that you were just asked about, abortion or immigration or whatnot. Place a token where you think each 20 Democrats would be on this scale. So we have people's perceived distributions. And what we can do from that is we can take the mean of their distribution, where they think Democrats and Republicans stand on average, but we can also get a measure of the variance, of the dispersion, the standard deviation of each of these distributions. So for each person, we have the mean and the standard deviation. And so I'll start with the means. And I break it down like this just because there's a lot of data. So the top is, the x-axis is perceived means, and it's rescaled to lie between most left and most right. And this is just abortion. Top is among Democrats, bottom is among Republicans. And so you see that this is the distribution of means, right? So on average, this is where Democrats think other Democrats are. On average, this is where Democrats think Republicans are. This is where Republicans think Democrats are. This is where Republicans think Republicans are. So it's bimodal. I guess not that surprising. What was surprising to us was that if you plot the actual means of where Democrats and Republicans stood, they're very close, that they're not that far off from one another. This is different from what I showed you before, but the elicitation method was a bit different. And if you look across all the items, you see that the difference between perceived means and actual means is just minuscule. The people are actually pretty accurate in guessing where Democrats and Republicans are using this elicitation method. Now, moving on to diversity. So again, this is the measures of standard deviations. So top is among Democrats, bottom is among Republicans, and these are, on the bottom is the standard deviations. What you see is that, so zero standard deviation would mean that people just put all the tokens in one right on top of each other, right? And you see that people perceive very little. The standard deviation across groups is about very similar between groups. People don't see more outgroup homogeneity than in-group homogeneity, or in-group heterogeneity, which is an issue, a point that psychologists might find interesting. But what we find, though, is that this is where the actual standard deviations are. This is how far apart they are in reality. So people perceive very little diversity, but in actuality, there's a lot of diversity. And to get a sense of the effect size, You can, oh, and here it is across issues. You see the same thing across issues. To get a sense of the effect size, so Cohen's d is the standardized effect size, and we can calculate the difference between the actual and perceived standard deviation and means. And so you see a Cohen's d of -3, so an enormous effect size in effect size world. Like we're used to effect sizes of 0.5 being big of the difference in standard deviations, but the difference in means is tiny. So I guess in conclusion, people are misperceiving diversity, at least according to this elicitation method, more than they're misperceiving distance. And it's something we should pay attention to because it may matter. And to test whether it matters, we ran a couple experiments. This first experiment, what we did is people are in various conditions. So a week later, we recontacted all these people. In the control condition, they only said, all right, what's your, how do you feel towards the out party? So we were only asking about the out party in this condition. In the mean prime condition, we only showed them the mean, we reminded them this is the mean, the average of the distribution you drew last week. And then we asked them their feeling thermometer scores. We either primed them with their distribution, where we showed them, this is the distribution you drew last week, or we did a correction, where we corrected, or we corrected the actual mean, we showed them the mean and then corrected the actual mean, or corrected them with the actual distribution of 20 randomly selected outpartisans. So here's what we find, that the mean prime, so this is out-party feeling thermometers, in-party feeling thermometers, and the difference. And you see that the mean prime had no effect, which is good for us. Mean correction had no effect. The distribution prime had no effect, but this distribution correction, showing people how they drew the distribution and then showing them what it was in reality, made people like the out party more and reduced the distance between the two. So I'll skip this, because I'm right at 15 minutes, but in sum, Americans' misperceptions of diversity are much larger than misperceptions of extremity, but we've only focused on extremity in the literature, as far as I know. And we know that correcting these misperceptions reduces partisan animosity. Don't really know the mechanism here, but it's certainly grounds for future research. And what this implies for both research and for journalists, and I'd be very interested in hearing from journalists how one would do this, is we need to move beyond the mean in analysis, meaning not just focus on means, but also in coverage. Are we just focusing on the same group of people, the same people in coffee shops, or can we somehow represent the diversity of viewpoints in the media when presenting public opinion? Thank you.
Didn't quite catch the accent coming back. You said coffee shops, and I was waiting for shops or something, but I didn't quite. But before the end of the day, I think maybe we'll get there with the accent. And it makes me think a bit about, we saw Beth's final slide with the Husker fans, and if we think maybe some Husker fans are nice, maybe there's a diversity, there's a range of fans, that we might enjoy, that might help us to reduce some of these attitudes in the way Yif and Beth were talking about. Okay, so our next presentation is a little peculiar. Dean Furlan is in Madison and on campus, but he is a dedicated teacher and advisor of graduate students, and as it turns out, a student of his had a dissertation defense scheduled for now. Being an academic, he didn't quite notice that scheduling issue, but being an expert in communication technology, he recorded a video of his presentation and ought to make it back for the discussion a little bit later. So we'll have Dean in the Big Brother mode up here presenting his video presentation unto us, and then hopefully the student's defense goes well, and Dean returns from, I think, Devon's office, I think is where he is, to zoom into the dissertation defense, and we'll come back and present at that time. But Dean Furlan is a professor at the University of North Carolina, just widely published in journals that are often places where mass communication scholars aren't able to publish, such as Science and Nature. And so is a widely read and widely cited scholar of social media, opinion, race, and politics in the United States. And so I'll stop by saying it worked when I tested it this morning. Let's see if it works now.
Hello, my name is Dean Freelon. I apologize for not giving this presentation in advance because I'm currently in the building or close chairing a master's thesis defense remotely that was scheduled at the same time as my panel. And so I hope to be back during the Q&A to answer some questions, but in the meantime, I'll go ahead and get started. Got a lot of stuff to talk about. So the presentation is called Into the Unknown: Political Life Online After Twitter, and it's really based around two questions. First, what are the consequences of Twitter's demise or ruination? And second, if we could optimize a post-Twitter platform for healthy civic and political conversation, what would that look like? And of course, the jumping off point here is Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter. Elon Musk is a Twitter user, like many of you are, presumably, and he had a lot of ideas for how to improve it. But he's found out the hard way that having ideas is a lot harder than implementing them. And so we've seen some evidence of where Twitter might go if he continues along this path. I made a few predictions about this on October 28th, which was a Friday, which was the day after Musk completed his acquisition of Twitter. So one prediction I made was that Twitter would sort of continue along the path that it had already been going on, status quo type path. The second is what I call dystopia. That's what happens if Musk can't keep a lid on spam, harassment, hate, violence, etc. Might be a little hard with over half the staff gone. And I predicted that this might lead to people leaving in droves, right? The site starting to look more like Parler or 8chan. And if that happens, crosses that tipping point, the site is pretty much done, or will be pretty much done as a mainstream public communication platform. Now, I want to stress we have not reached that point yet, although people predict that we might pretty soon. And I think that if things keep going the way they are going, we might very well see that point very soon. So what you're looking at now on the left side of the screen is the Twitter Blue sign-up page that used to be available through iOS. Now, this is not available now for reasons that we'll explore on the next slide. Musk has said that Twitter is planning on relaunching Twitter Blue on November 29th. But as of now, I personally can't do this. You can actually check your iOS device to see if you have access to Twitter Blue. Just take a look in your menu, see if it's there. It's not there for me. Now, if you look at the text that is highlighted on the right side of this slide, you'll see this interesting sentence that says, accounts that receive the blue checkmark as part of a Twitter Blue subscription will not undergo review to confirm that they meet the active, notable, and authentic criteria that was used in the previous process. That means that if you fork over money for Twitter verification, they just hand you a blue check. Doesn't matter who you are. What is the problem with this? Let's take a look. So you may have seen this tweet by a false account that was spoofing Eli Lilly and Company, makers of insulin. Fake tweet says, we are excited to announce insulin is free now. You can see the drop in stock price that came after this tweet, which was posted on November the 10th, the day after Twitter Blue went on sale. So I'm not trying to prove causation or causality here. I'm not casual with that, but the timing is, I think, remarkable. Lilly tried to course correct. The actual Lilly account is over here on the right. But by that point, of course, the damage had been done. Here's another example. This is from an analysis by the Center for Countering Digital Hate that was released on November 12th. This is a look at weekly mentions of the N-word on Twitter, actually from around the beginning of the year to right around the time Elon Musk completed the Twitter deal. You can see there's an uptick there. Again, nothing to say about causality here, but really a trend to watch to see if this continues. This is something that I'm sure that Black Twitter is very concerned about. I personally am very concerned about it. Anyone who thinks racism is bad, I think, should be concerned about this. And if it is a trend that continues, I think that could lead or could fuel an exodus away from the platform. Here are a couple of ads that I personally have received. I also documented these on November 12th. On the left is an anti-COVID vaccine ad. I would characterize it as COVID misinformation. You can see I got suckered into 2 shots of Moderna mod RNA, feeding on fears of the COVID shot modifying DNA or RNA, clear misinformation signifier there. On the right, we see climate disinformation that is provided by Nick. Not going to try to pronounce his last name, but you can see that there is some false or misleading content around EVs, the supposed environmental damage of wind and solar. In addition to the terrible targeting of this, right? If you know anything about me, you know that I would not endorse these messages at all. You can also see that this is spreading messages that are likely to result in some very real harm. And so this is something that is new for me, at least. I'm curious about your experiences with this, but I did not see this before the Musk takeover. So when contemplating the end of Twitter, I do have a few follow-up questions, and I hope that we'll be able to discuss some of these during Q&A, assuming I can make it back on time. So if Twitter, goes away completely or devolves, I'm really interested in this question of who's really going to suffer most. Which communities out there have really, really invested a lot in Twitter that would really, I think, have a problem if Twitter goes away? Also, how would your personal, political, and civic life change? So do you use Twitter a lot? Would you really miss it? Are you maybe somebody who doesn't use Twitter a whole lot and is wondering what the fuss is about? And I'm also curious about whether this will be a net negative, right? Or thinking about some of the positives. People complain about Twitter being a hell site or a hellscape. I would submit that people didn't really know what a hell site was until Musk took over. So thinking about some of the benefits that might come from the end of Twitter, I think is not just a flippant thing, but something that we really should consider. And then, of course, this all leads to the question of how important Twitter is to American political communication anyway. So I think I'm too close to it. I've been a Twitter user since late 2009. I've studied Twitter, written many, many papers about it. And so I'm kind of not a great person to ask this question, but people who have a little bit more distance, I think, can provide a bit more of a disinterested view of this. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about how important Twitter really is to our national political conversation. Thinking about a world after Twitter, if Twitter really does go away, what's going to happen? Some of you may have heard a little bit about Mastodon, the federated alternative to Twitter. It's distributed. People run their own servers on a volunteer basis, which you can join. And this is one of a number of illustrative tweets and messages that I've seen over the past couple of weeks, kind of criticizing Mastodon for its difficulty of use. And so you might look at this and say, well, who is this woman? She can't use Mastodon, you know what I mean? Like, is that really representative? I think this is some really important piece of context, which shows that she is an engineering manager at Spotify. So this is a person who should have some degree of technical facility with these kinds of things. I share this, sentiment. I'm an open source software developer. I've been on the internet since the early 90s. And so I really think that if people that of this technical ability are finding Mastodon difficult to use, what does that say about the average user who doesn't have those technical facilities and the extent that they'll be capable of engaging with it? And I think we should really take these warnings seriously when we're thinking about what's going to or what's likely to replace Twitter should it shut down or become unusable. Let's consider some of the other post-Twitter alternatives, right? So this ranges from relatively new entrants like Counter Social, which is available now, Blue Sky Social, that is backed by Jack Dorsey. It hasn't launched yet. I signed up for the beta or the pre-release version. I don't know exactly what it's going to be, how it's going to work, but it's a potential competitor. And then we have existing alternatives like Tumblr, TikTok, and even Facebook, right? I mean, Facebook actually had a tweet thread about this a while ago where I asked, if Twitter goes down, where are you going? Only one person mentioned Facebook. And I noted to that person, I said, actually, of all the alternatives people have mentioned, Facebook actually has the feature set that's closest to Twitter. So this could be a situation where folks go back to Facebook. I know people have a lot of problems with Facebook, but I think it is important to keep all options on the table as we think about this, because it's not just about what we want. If we're studying this, we also need to think about where the people are going. So trying to keep all this in mind is really, really important as we think about the shape that a sort of a post-Twitter world ends up taking. I feel like it's really important to get speculative when we talk about this. So I really want to ask this question about how you would design your own idealized post-Twitter platform that is designed to maximize political discourse quality as you define it. And so I have a few criteria. I thought a little bit about this. And so these are my personal criteria. Some of them, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the rules that I would want on my own, social media system. So first of all, clearly posted and enforced rules about what is and isn't allowed. I think, both Twitter and Facebook have gotten in trouble by allowing, very powerful users, Trump and other heads of state to do things that they don't let less powerful or prominent individuals do. So in my social media platform, everybody has, the same rules. Everything is applied to the same extent to everyone. It's very, very important. I do think it's really, really important to talk about protections for minorities and other vulnerable populations. And I don't think this is a violation of the previous bullet. We know empirically that certain individuals, women, Black people, members of the trans community experience disproportionate harassment and attacks on social media. And I think that the anti-harassment policy needs to take that into account. And so I think that we need to trust these individuals when they make these reports and integrate policies that really take account of that, which to my knowledge, no social media system has done. Thirdly, I think we need I would want rather a TSA pre-check style verification system, right? So when you pay however much money TSA pre-check is, you're not buying a known traveler number. You are submitting your information and your sort of credentials to a verification authority, which may or may not give you that known traveler number, depending on the outcome of that verification. And so instead of, Twitter Blue just handing you a blue check when you pay $8, what they should do is go through the process of verifying that you are who you are. And if you pass that process, then you get your blue check. And so that, means that verification is what it says it is, rather than simply being something that allows you to get paid prioritization for your tweets, which is what it is now. Fourthly, zero tolerance for science and health misinformation. This is very important on areas where the science is essentially settled. So climate is a great example of this. Genetically modified organisms is a great example of this. I think the COVID vaccines are pretty close if they're not there already. And so all these areas, which I think we could actually delineate and state what these areas are, people spreading that kind of mis and disinformation, I don't think I would tolerate. There are certain areas where I think there are scientific controversies. We can have those discussions. But when the science is pretty much settled, I don't really see any place for that on my social media system. Fifthly, I'm not even sure whether this exists, but if it doesn't, I think it should. A threshold of complaints about a post would trigger a manual review for terms of service violations. And so this really tries to triage efforts to remove harmful content, focusing on the most viewed content. So if something really gets, lights on fire and a lot of people are complaining about it, somebody comes in and looks at it. But I think this also needs to be paired with the banning of serial violators of the complaint mechanism. So people who try to weaponize complaints against folks they don't like, continuing complaining about things, saying they violate terms of service when they don't, that I think is something that needs to be punished with banning. Maybe a warning first, but I think serial violation of that would warrant banning on my system. So that's just a few things that I would want in my own personal social media system, and I'd love to hear what some of your policies would be if you were sort of in charge. I'm going to end there. I know I only have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to stop, and hopefully I'll get a chance to catch up with you during Q&A. So thank you.
Oh, great. Hopefully this pops back up soon. I'm not sure what happened there. Do the highly technical jiggling of the cords. See if that does anything. Well, and Dean has made it back, so when we get to our conversation in just a moment, we'll have Dean. I wonder, Rowan, if you could identify Jim. Let's see if we can't get this fixed. I will first do what our technologist always tells me to do, which is unplug it and plug it back in. See if that does anything. Hey, look at that. Sterling would be so proud of me. Okay, so our final talk of the morning before we'll have we'll have a brief discussion moderated by Devon. And so we'll have our final talk, then this discussion. So right now, if our students could grab the note cards and pencils from Sadie, We'll pass around note cards. So if you have a question that you would like to be a part of the moderated discussion, you can write it on a note card, hand it to one of our students, and then we'll pass it to Devon, and he'll use that to help shape and animate the discussion we'll have with everyone. But before that, batting cleanup, number 5 on your program, number 1 in your hearts, Professor Dana Young of the University of Delaware. Dana and I started as assistant professors at UD at the same time in 2006, and helped start a Center for Political Communication Research there. Since then, I have floundered, and she has skyrocketed into superstardom in the academy, written a fantastic book, Irony and Outrage, and also has been doing work where she takes the scholarship she does, which is incredibly rigorous, and communicates it to all manner of audiences. Her TED Talk has about 2 million views, and just completed putting together a great courses series that you can watch in 2023. So not just the scholarship, it's also the presentation, which I now realize is setting expectations higher than I maybe ought to have. So we're very excited to have Dana Young.
Hi, thanks so much. What a lovely introduction. That was amazing. Don't get your hopes too high, or I will be a disappointment. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you at the level of about 30,000 feet and contextualize most of the things that we've heard throughout all of the talks today. So the book that I just got the manuscript into the editor looks at what I'm calling the demand for American wrongness. And I'll explain what that means. And the book explores the sort of social psychology of wrong and its roots in political sectarianism in the United States, and the way that our media and political elites feed into this harmful dynamic. So I think we would all agree, right, that civic life requires adherence to a certain set of agreed upon facts. We have to be able to agree upon aspects of reality for democratic governance to operate, just to function, correct? And we also know that we have a problem of misinformation. Now, the scope of the problem itself may not be unique to this particular historical moment. Misinformation and conspiracy theories have always been. But the speed with which they spread, and because of the nature of the media environment, that may be something that is unique to this moment. So around the globe, and in the US in particular, we are finding increased concern about this misinformation crisis, right? Like, this is where a lot of scholars are spending their time. So journalists, scholars, lawmakers, health professionals, all worrying about the role of misinformation, that is, information that is empirically false, as well as the public's belief in that false or inaccurate information. So what I'm going to do, though, is shift our attention from that side, which is misinformation supply, right, on the content side of misinformation, to think a little bit about demand. Because unfortunately, the reason that misinformation and conspiracy theories are prevalent, the reason that they spread like wildfire, the reason that they are powerful is because we are attracted to them, because false information actually does something for us. We are attracted to misinformation not because we want to be wrong, but we really don't want to be right, as much as we want to understand our world, have some control over our world, and feel like we're a part of a community. So my work is rooted in those 3 things, that we want to comprehend, control, and have community. And all of those things are very much shaped by how we think of ourselves as part of a team. So that's kind of the center of my talk today. So how do we come to know the things we know? Right? Because that is what misinformation beliefs are. They are things that we believe we know, even if they are false, they constitute our knowledge, okay? So how do we come to know the things we know? Well, philosophers of science would say, well, there are 2 main ways that we come to know the things we know. On the one hand, we have observations of the world, right? And we would think in a rational model that our observations of the world then go into inform the theories, values, and beliefs that we hold, right? We observe things, and then we draw conclusions about those things. But we also know that the theories, values, and beliefs that we hold literally shape the very things that we see. We engage in motivated reasoning, confirmation bias. Our observations of the world are, as philosophers say, theory-laden. We come to our perceptions of the world through the lens of our own beliefs. So now it's time to think a little bit about the fact that social identity, or what team we are a part of, is very much at the heart of the origins of those theories, values, and beliefs that we hold. So we tend to want to think about the world in ways that are consistent with the way that our team thinks about the world. So this team, this social identity, where do these come from? And this is where I need another half hour, but I don't have it. So in the American political context, we're in a bit of a pickle, okay? Because social identities can be anything. I think of myself as a native of New Hampshire. I'm also a UD Blue Hen. Went to the University of New Hampshire. I'm also a suburban mom. So all of these are kind of teams that I think of myself as a part of. But what is salient? What is our social identity that's salient in a given moment? Well, in the US political context, because over the past 40 years, really since the time of Bill Krause, the two political parties in the United States have become more socially sorted along these primal lines of race, religion, ethnicity, culture. Now, that does not mean that every single Democrat and every single Republican aligns in these certain ways in terms of their demographics and their culture and their ideology. But by and large, that social sorting has happened, okay? What that means is that even if we have these different ideas about who we worship or our ideological positions, we have different racial identities, we have different religious identities, in the United States context, those things are tending to be more overlapping with our political party. So the result is we have these political mega identities that tend to be all-encompassing. And when a political identity is all-encompassing, that means we have really good fit. And when you have a really good fit with that particular identity, it means that identity is salient. So we have the increasing likelihood that you're going to have these packages. And again, these packages aren't necessarily about specific policy positions as much as they're about an entire way of life, right? You see someone, you're like, oh, that is a person who drives this kind of car, listens to this kind of music, lives in this kind of place. I know who they are. So now, what does that mean? Let me just go back for a second. What does that mean in terms of how potent these are and how salient they are? What it means is that when these things are overlapping in these ways, we will tend to react more emotionally if our identities are in alignment with the identities within our team, okay? So we will respond more emotionally. That identity will be salient. We're easier to ignite. We're easier to stir up. So there was that wonderful quote about people want policies and partisans want to inflame or something. I thought immediately of this because that is exactly what we're dealing with, because in the context of political mega identities, those things are easy to do because they tap into primal aspects, not of what we believe, but of who we are. So unfortunately, our political and media context lends itself to and is incentivized to exploit these very things, because these political mega identities are highly exploitable. They're super good for getting us riled up and for getting us to take action. That means that among political elites, so this is the kind of framework that I've been developing, we have political elites who recognize that they need to draw upon the social identities of their base, so they're drawing upon those social identities, and then they're providing rhetoric and speeches and rallies that serve as some of the observations of the world that we will then use to update our values, theories, and beliefs. But guess what? Those things that we're using to update our values, theories, and beliefs are already really rooted in those social identities that we started with in the first place. What does this look like? For political elites messaging, it is a focus on identity threat. So really we're talking about within the culture war issues, anything related to sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and religion, because that is where this sorting has happened and that is where it is most primal in terms of how our responses become activated. So political elites are incentivized to engage in the activation of identity threat. They do that by focusing on nationalized culture war issues, things like critical race theory, which is a really popular one right now. And they engage in what's called identity ownership. This comes from our friends Crease, Lawrence, and McGregor, who talk about how because of the social sorting that has taken place, you have the incentives among political elites to try to prove that they are the poster child for their team. Not the average member of their team, but they best characterize all of the qualities of their team. So we end up with displays such as Ted Cruz with the anti-racist baby book at Justice Jackson's nomination hearing. This I would call a display of identity ownership. Next, we have within the context of journalism and news. How do journalism and news norms tap into social identity and provide us with observations that reinforce those identities? Here, unfortunately, I would say, not unfortunately, but I would just like to note that it seems to be more inadvertent than in terms of the other factors. Because for journalism, we have these news norms, particularly conflict framing, strategy framing, game framing, right versus left, Democrat versus Republican. This is not designed to mobilize partisans. This is designed to tell a dramatic story. It's a shortcut. It allows people to understand stories very quickly. It follows the narrative frame of conflict. This also will activate repeatedly our sense of partisan identity. We know from oodles of studies that as the conflict frame dominates our political coverage, people increasingly think of themselves as members of their political team. Journalists also tend to reward those elite displays of identity ownership, like the one that we saw from Ted Cruz. That particular moment from the nomination hearings was covered widely in the press, more so than other kinds of questioning of Justice Jackson during those hearings, because it is emotional and it's about those culture war issues and it is going to ignite the passions. So there are pressures for profit that create these sort of self-reinforcing dynamics within journalism, which centers on the profitability of these culture war issues. And as a side note, a whole other issue is the death of local newspapers. When local newspapers die, that means that if people are politically interested, their attention is going to go where? To the national. They're going to focus on national politics, which again is going to tend to hinge on those national culture war issues. Potholes are a lot less sexy and a lot less enraging than national culture war issues. Here's a couple of those conflict framing headlines that are really not difficult to find. My favorite, as in least favorite, Biden and Trump say they're fighting for America's soul. What does that mean? Those are conflict frames. Next up, most obvious, partisan media. So our friends at Fox and One America Network and Newsmax and MSNBC's opinion shows, their entire economic model hinges on the economics of outrage. Outrage is about identity threat. It is about what our team does, what is good for our team, and how the other team is trying to either attack us or threaten our status. Partisan media also makes extensive use of data analytics, so they know in real time what the emotional responses are and what content gets those emotional responses. And so the economic engine underlying partisan media really incentivizes this kind of framing. So here's our friend Tucker Carlson. Will leaders sit back as the invasion happens? Identity threat. And finally, social media newsfeed pages and groups. This is where it's probably the easiest lift to understand how they tap into social identity and offer up observations that reinforce those social identities. Here we know that the algorithms incentivize and reward moralized emotional content. That's content that tends to say, this is what ought to be and this is what oughtn't, right? This is what is morally good, this is what is morally bad. That lends itself to content that focuses on identity threat. We're also incentivized in those spaces because we're within a social network, we're incentivized to perform our social identity. We want to be good members of our team, so we want to express things that focus on how, I am the poster child of my team. It is a display of identity ownership. And of course, micro-level targeting and data analytics all make this engine run. So the result is this identity distillation machinery. We have synergistic forces where all of these anticipate the dynamics of the others, and social identity is reinforced again and again. When it comes to what can we do, I will just say at the level, especially the levels of journalism, social media, and the individual, there are many things we can do in terms of disrupting conflict framing in journalism, in terms of investing in local news, in terms of requiring social media companies to be more transparent with their algorithms and provide data to researchers, and at the individual level, allowing people to reshuffle the deck. This speaks directly to what Beth talked about and what Yif talked about. Recognizing that not everyone who is a member of a team of a political party is the poster child for that party, and to make those assumptions is harmful. So that may also mean disrupting our own performances of partisan mega identity, which might make you, not the favorite among your partisan team, but it would be a more honest representation, and it would help the information space that we all share. And finally, what we can do is we can acknowledge that we might be wrong. That is the best thing that we can do to get ourselves closer to empirical truth. Thanks.
Let us hear from Devon and our wonderful panelists.
Wonderful. Let's have another round of applause for those great presentations. Just a lot to chew on, and a lot that I think brings these different themes together across these presentations. And it's always, I was sitting next to Lou, and Lou was remarking after each presentation, this is such a good panel. This is an amazing, oh my gosh, the last one just fits so well. And it's very true. I mean, there's a set of connections here and a conversation that's happening across these panelists. So I'd like to start by just kind of throwing out a couple questions to you as I then get through the questions that we have from the audience, and just open them up to all of you. And one of them is I heard what you were talking about, especially the notion of plurality and understanding the range of viewpoints that we think people who may not share our political affiliation or our team membership have. One of the things I think when you were, Dana, when you were presenting, that very last idea of we see these people who are poster childs for their team, is that anchoring our judgments? And this goes to Yif's and to your question about our notion of how restricted we think of that opposing group. Is it because the media keeps showing us those exemplars? And it's interesting that we have a sense of where the overall party is, but we don't have that range. And so I'd just love to throw that open to all of you, but to start with Beth and Yifs and down.
Sure. So I do think that there is a message that we hear over and over and over again about who the two sets of partisans are. And I really like the idea of identity, because I think that sense of identity also, it does create this prototype of what this is. And then we want to be part of that. So I do think it's partly the media. I also think it's just partly psychology. I think we like being part of a team, and the more people are less really embedded in communities of real people and instead are embedded in these communities of fake stuff out there. I think we cling to that sense of that team more than normal. And so it all plays on each other. I mean, I don't know that there's one thing and then another thing. I think it all kind of plays off of each other.
Yeah. I would agree. I do think that we get our images of what the team is or are from the media. I also think there's this kind of feedback loop where people see Trump is the Republican Party, then other people start behaving like Trump, and people start seeing that that's what's normative, and it just cycles and gets more and more extreme. So I would say not only do we get our exemplars from the media, but the kind of feedback between the media and the public drives our perceptions of the exemplars further to the right or left.
Yeah, and I would just say there's a wonderful study, Mike, that you had done looking at who is rewarded in terms of press coverage. And it is those at the ideological extremes. So to the extent that our media organizations are focused on highlighting the dramatic or the scandalous or what is novel, that is what they will focus on. I mean, as I was working on my book, I thought there is no reason why everyone in the country should know the name of an obscure Georgia congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yet we all know who she is because by the performances of identity that she engages in are expert. And she does it every day, and she's rewarded for it every day.
That's great. I want to get to our other two panels. We have specific questions for both Danielle and Dean, so I'll start with you, Danielle. A question from one of our graduate students specifically about how are social media portrayals of protest different than news media portrayals of protest? And does the protest paradigm really hold up in social media, or has social media democratized those kinds of presentations? So we see a wider range, and actually that's opened up our sense of what the reality of those protests is.
Yeah, the protest paradigm doesn't, maybe probably didn't put this in the right place because you can't hear me, but maybe I'm closer now. The protest paradigm doesn't really hold up in lots of places, to be honest, especially since media has become more democratized. I think social media offers opportunities to divest in that binary legitimizing narrative. But one of the things that I didn't talk about, because I only have 15 minutes and I wanted to cram as much stuff as I could in, was that, just even thinking about that in terms of delegitimizing and legitimizing is the binary is a problem, right? Because some people look at violence and understand the anger that creates it. Some people look at, for example, in that rioty disruption category is also the blocking of highways to get people's attention. Some people look at that and they understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to really get everyone's attention because people aren't paying attention on the news, or people aren't paying attention at town hall or in the voting system. So I think that social media offers opportunities to bring that to the forefront, and we have seen it disrupt the paradigm. It's not a great theory. We keep going back to how it's not a great theory to apply directly without evolving what we know about it to present day, but still the baseline gives us a framework and lots of ways to just kind of show the critical race issue that is present with the representation of anti-racism protests, for sure, in the United States.
That's great. I want to kind of connect that to a question Dean was asking, and it also comes up in the question we have for Dean. Social media has been a platform that's been really important for movements like Black Lives Matter, for movements like Me Too. Do those groups suffer? Do those organizing efforts suffer when we lose platforms like Twitter? Or will it always just gravitate to another space?
Yeah, so someone asked me a question that was very similar. I was talking to a reporter from BuzzFeed earlier this week, and he asked me a similar question, and I said, my initial answer to that is that I don't think we know yet, because the internet was a very different place when Black Twitter formed, when Twitter was a very new social network. This is, the late 2000s. Twitter started in 2006. There was a really great article, if you're interested in this, sort of a people's history of Black Twitter. It came out in Wired. And people, very prominent individuals, people with well-known names, talked about how they first found it, what the alternatives were. If you can remember back then, this is sort of like, MySpace is sort of on the way out. Facebook has been out for, 3 or 4 years. YouTube comes out in 2005. This is before Instagram, it's before TikTok. And so I think that people tended to gravitate. Actually, one of the most interesting things about this article is that everybody who mentions going onto Twitter from the Black Twitter side, they all said the same thing, which was that there was already a pre-existing group of Black people there. So in other words, the reporter didn't manage to interview or find patient zero here, the first person, to find Twitter, first Black person to find Twitter. And so I think it's interesting to see that this group, in miniature, this is sort of a microcosm, I think, of a lot of the questions that are sort of that you asked. This group came about at a time when cell phone use was very low, right? Like we weren't used to having cameras on our phones, Android comes out in 2008, the iPhone was released in 2007. And so as the internet, internet penetration wasn't what it was. It wasn't what it is now. And so I think that it's a hard question to ask about who really suffers, because, one possibility is that, folks could en masse end up going to a new social media option, or possibly an old one, and then everything could be pretty much fine. They could reproduce it in short order. Another option is, a possibility is that there could be a sort of a diasporic spreading to different places, balkanization, this kind of thing. So I don't think we can really answer that, but I think as social scientists, those of us who are that in the room, I think it's in many cases incumbent upon us to try to figure out the answer empirically. And so I look forward to contributing to that answer in the months and years to come.
So a follow-up question for Dean. This is a provocative one from our department chair, Hernando Rojas, so singling you out. Where's Hernando? There's Hernando. Look at him when you answer this question.
Sure.
Dean's version of Twitter sounds like WeChat-style control. How does one maintain liberty in highly regulated systems?
Sure. Well, I think, my suggestion is one that tries to balance regulation and liberty and freedom of speech and this sort of thing, right? So, my personal view is that when people talk about freedom of speech, they should be primarily, if not exclusively, talking about government, encroachments onto that. I think that when you're talking about a private platform, you can ask people to leave that at your leisure if you're the owner of that. Right? There's no guarantee, nor should there be, in my opinion, that anyone should have the ability to use someone else's private property to speak. I just don't believe in that. And I think that we've seen, I showed evidence of this in absentia, of what happens when, the locks come off.
Yep.
Right? So folks, it becomes very toxic for certain groups of people, but not others. That burden tends to fall on folks that have historically been disenfranchised. And that's something that I think that there should be spaces in which that is acknowledged. I think that on most social media systems, at least in my estimation, tend to err too much on the side of allowing too much harassment and too much abuse to occur, and to enforce their terms of service too unevenly. And so that I think it's fine and good and a positive thing to have a space in which that balance is shifted a little bit, and I'm happy to stand behind that.
That's great. This kind of segues perfectly into a question for Beth, and I will open this up to everybody again. When you're talking about research on civic respect, and typically you're looking at people being exposed to opposing opinions, have you done research where they're exposed to uncivil or hostile behaviors from the opposing sides, and what might that do, given that that's so much of what we see online in terms of those same perceptions?
Yeah, we did not introduce people to really hostile interactions with other people. I think that the fact that we found so little civic respect, even with benign, just saying, this is somebody in the party you oppose, and we're getting the kinds of responses we do. I think that we would only find it worse. I mean, in a very hostile, uncivil world, we're just going to get people absolutely, no, I can't respect them. I should say that in our book, Jeff and I do set boundaries on civic respect, whereas recognition respect is universal, civic respect we think is not. And one of the boundaries we set on civic respect is that because civic respect is embedded in our understanding of democracy and democratic equality, you have to believe in democracy to be able to give civic respect. So we set that as a boundary. But nonetheless, I think in our current environment, you can have very hostile interactions even within the confines of a democratic system. And I think we would just have less civic respect.
And Dana, does that fit with what you know about outrage and the effort to generate outrage?
So I was thinking a little bit in terms of and I talked to Beth about this earlier, the project that I've been doing with my graduate students looking at who is it that's actually producing a lot of the content that we see, especially in the social media context. And I think that's where I got fascinated by the idea of incentives, because of what we see being covered by the press, because of what's rewarded by these algorithms, because the angry emoji on Facebook gets upweighted so many times, because it's moralized emotional content that tends to go viral on Twitter. We actually found, we've been looking at this trait called intellectual humility, which is to what extent you're willing to be open to the idea that you might be wrong. And intellectual humility is this wonderful correlate of all kinds of great things like altruism, but also reduced belief in misinformation. So what we found was that among individuals who are intellectually humble, they are the least likely to express themselves on social media. It's the intellectually, it gets better. It's the intellectually arrogant who are most likely to express themselves on social media, and because it's the intellectually arrogant who also tend to hold the highest levels of misinformation beliefs, you put one and one together and you're like, well, oh crap. It is the intellectually arrogant who are expressing themselves on social media, and they're also tending to embrace false information. So there are these cycles that are at play that I think are, problematic.
I love the word problematic. It's just so beautifully antiseptic. So this is a more general question. I love this. I'm going to do it in two parts because two separate questions, but I think they're related. I haven't heard anyone talk about some sort of national mandatory service. It seems like it would force young people to interact with people who are different from them while privileging some social good. Thoughts? And associated with that, what are key items to focus on for college students to be effective citizens? We'll just start with you. If we haven't had you speak for a bit, so put you on the spot for a second. How's your Wisconsin education holding up in terms of making those?
So people have talked about this idea, not here, but this idea of kind of like a mission to, send people from Milwaukee to the farmlands and vice versa. It could work. There's quite a bit of work showing that intergroup discussion reduces polarization. My concern with these types of interventions generally is that, A, we don't know how long-lasting they are, and they're probably not that long-lasting. The kinds of interventions that people have done where they bring people in and have a discussion, they say they're depolarized, and they go home. But then 2 days later, they're listening to the news, and they are polarized again. So I like these ideas in general, and it's very much what practitioners are focused on kind of getting people together in one room, having a discussion. But in my mind, things are structural, and there are incentives in the media, there are incentives in politics that incentivize behavior that's polarizing. So no matter how many interventions you do, the problem remains. So I'm happy for there to be such interventions, but I don't think it will cure the issues.
Well, theoretically, a mandatory regime of national participation would be structural, but I keep getting stuck on that word mandatory. Americans don't tend to like mandates. They didn't like mask mandates. They don't like vaccine mandates. Choice, right? That's the American way, right? Being able to choose things and to be able to decide whether something is right for you. I find it interesting that many of the countries that do have national service mandates demographically are monocultural, right? So South Korea is a good example of this. Singapore, I believe Israel has similar requirements for the military, things of this nature. So the feasibility of it, I think, is one question. But what if, rather than making it mandatory, we simply provided incentives for it? Right? So in other words, we paid people to do it. So you don't have to, but hey, here are some advantages to doing this, right? Here are some ways that you can, so clearly it's going to mean that certain people are going to opt in rather than others. That's one of the disadvantages of not making it mandatory. But if you can lure people in by the time they actually make the decision to do it, then they're more invested, rather than feeling like they're forced to do it. And that may compensate for some of the disadvantages there.
For what it's worth, South Korea and Israel are very polarized places.
No, I meant ethnically. So
Yeah. But
ethnically monocultural. Yeah.
So I hear this and I'm like, well, the idea of paying people, you're still going to end up with inequities in who is going to serve, right? If it's pay for service. So my father is a wonderful sounding board for a lot of my work, because he tells me when I'm in the weeds or not making sense or not being respectful enough to different viewpoints. And he, at the end of every conversation, is like, it's what I always say, we need to have mandatory service. And that is his answer every time. And he was drafted in 1962, and he said it completely changed his worldview. And because he was with people from all different experiences, and he was petrified, as many were, being drafted, but he says it was the best thing that ever happened to him. So I think about those little anecdotes, and I think, there's something to be said for, by the way, we don't like mandatory things in the US, but the draft wasn't that long ago. The military draft wasn't that long ago. So,
So this is a great question. Just one second, Lou. We have a society that seems to be very focused, especially in our current discourse, and we've been talking about this within our research groups, on discourse about rights, and very little discourse about citizens and obligations. And I'm curious, again, going back to Danny's work on BLM, and a lot of that wasn't just the demand for rights, but also many people who are supporting that movement seeing it as an obligation to say, hey, we have to support this. And that's part of what social media did. I'm really concerned about this duality between rights and obligations and how little attention we pay to obligations. And I think that mandatory service question is a really interesting, do we need to have a reorientation towards obligation, towards pluralism? Are these parts of the solution? So I'll throw that open to the whole panel.
just real quick, the results of the midterms in terms of the turnout among young people suggest that the Gen Z, voters, I bet that if we looked at what was driving some of what they perceived as was incumbent upon them, I think that it was probably a sense that, I have an obligation. There is a big threat here, and I have some kind of obligation. I mean, I would be interested to see that, because I don't know that, I think that there is an organic sense among some of the younger people who came of age right around 2016 that it is incumbent upon me to make my voice heard. I think that we should look into how that's playing out.
I tend to focus on human rights issues, which are polarized, obviously, in a very right-left conundrum. And I think that, when we think about Gen Z, we see their human rights, and they're thinking about things differently. They're thinking about gender in non-binary ways. They are seeing race in ways that they haven't, that other generations chose not to see it, right? And I think that we're talking about a generation that is seeing rights being stripped away by people who are close to them. Remember, that's who we trust, right? We trust the people who are right next to us. They're watching that happen. And so when we think about exactly what Dan was saying, how they are constructing their moral values and their obligations. It's from their experiences. They're watching their right to reproduce or not take away. They're watching rights being taken away every day, and it affects them personally. And so I don't think, hey, look, me being an optimist again.
Wow.
I know, it's like twice a year.
Madison will do that to you. It just makes us all into slight optimists. So heading in a slightly different direction, and again, more general, why isn't public TV or public radio, or more generally, talk radio, which is something that we've spent a lot of time focusing on in Wisconsin, given there's an enormous number of hours of political talk radio on the air every day. It covers the entire state, many of the news deserts, for example. What about talk radio? What about public media? Is that part of the answer for this, or is that part of the problem?
Well, those are two different things.
Well, yeah.
Right?
Odds with each other.
Well, right, the rise of talk radio is a very interesting subject about which there's a lot of really great scholarship. Public media in this country is a topic that is, the U.S. is a bit of an outlier in terms of that. We don't have a national sort of, media corporation the way that the UK does, or Canada, or Australia. And so, NPR is probably the closest thing to it, but it operates very differently. It's funded very differently. And so I think that in the United States, NPR's brand is such that it would have to engage in a substantial amount of rebranding to make people feel as though it is something that they would want to listen to if they're not whatever white, middle class, middle aged, whatever the stereotype of the NPR listener is. It's got that brand, and my guess is if you wanted to do something public media to appeal up beyond that demographic, you would need to build something new, I think, because of the audience that NPR has.
Minnesota offers a really interesting case study, though, for NPR, especially because NPR, Minnesota Public Radio, has several black hosts that have been there for a really long time. So Angela Davis, not the Angela Davis, the activist, but Angela Davis, a long time journalist there. She's in there in the morning, and she's been there for a long time, and she's, again, one of the most trusted local journalists for black communities, and one of the most listened to news outlets in all of the state. So just an interesting rebrand, for sure. Angela Davis?
Yeah.
Minnesota.
She's NPR, Minnesota Public Radio.
Lou, you had a question.
I don't answer the question, just a point of information that Wes Moore, the new governor of Maryland, has proposed to Bureau of Service as a centerpiece of his program, which we certainly intend to implement, which will be voluntary but incentivized through college scholarships, I believe is the mechanism. And he sees it as both a heterogeneity building exercise, but also equity exercise. I just wanted to insert that.
I think when I said the problems are structural, and why I think public radio is, or not, public media is an answer, is that the media is incentivized to get clicks, and the way it does so is through information that is polarizing, through outrageous content. And public radio, public media, is ostensibly not incentivized by advertising. So if we had a real, movement towards there, if we had some investment in there, I could see the, moving towards that model as a real solution.
I would also just follow up and say the work by Victor Picard, one of your colleagues, looking across countries at where democratic health is most robust, and one of the strong predictors of democratic health is in places that have a very well-funded public media infrastructure, and it's stable, and it's a long-term investment. So it's like they know it's going to be there, and it's because of just that they're not, the content is not dictated by what is going to inflame audiences and get them riled up.
Have a couple more questions, and we're pushing into the envelope of what Mike was allowing us with his delegated authority. What are the potential consequences of relatively stable and high levels of political trust? Is it a good sign or a good thing for the public to be skeptical or not skeptical about government? How trusting should we be of government? I guess is another way to put it. Is a certain amount of skepticism healthy?
So I obviously, I think that some skepticism is a good thing, but I'm so worried about the low level of political trust we have, because a lot of times when there is a solution to a problem, it needs to be solved with government involvement. Government is big enough to be able to deal with it, whereas a local soup kitchen can't, if we're looking like at hunger or something like that. You need government involvement, and yet trust in government is so incredibly low and has been dropping since, what, 1964, something like that. It's just been dropping precipitously, and now people don't even think to turn to government. So my two young adult children, they've grown up in a household where we sit around and talk over dinner about politics nonstop. I mean, that's what we do in our family. And yet they both, as soon as you suggest that government might be a solution to the problem, they both write it off. And I just think this is a horrible problem for our country. So some skepticism is fine, but man, we need to do something about trust in government.
Yeah, I think it's less about absolute levels and then about the distance between how corrupt the government is, how effective the government is, and how much we should trust it. So, you go to countries that are not working well objectively and they're trusting government, that's also a problem.
That's right.
So, in this country, the government can work, but nobody believes it can, and so there's a big gap. So I think we should focus on reducing perceptions or correcting perceptions.
And there's also the low trust in government invites authoritarian populists to capitalize on that low trust in government, right? Because if bureaucracy and government can't be trusted and it's messy and they're corrupt, then we have folks who come in and say, we need to drain the swamp. And that is a pathway to sort of autocracy that I don't think that we should be trying to set the stage for.
So last question again for all the panelists. Almost all of you mentioned big media institutions. I think every presentation included a mention of Fox News. Are there media oligarchies, and if so, should they be broken up? Dan, you have an opinion.
Yes, but how?
That was the second part of the question, is and how?
I'll say yes to the first one. Someone else can answer the next one.
Well, I think, are there media oligarchies? I think empirically you would have to answer that yes. I mean, if you define an oligarchy as, a business that's dominated by a very small number of very large entrants, that's clearly true in our media system. I think, I looked at history about this, right? So I think about different types of media. Maybe we don't often think of AT&T as media, but, phones are certainly a type of media. Right, so in 1984, right, the government broke up the Bell monopoly and sort of split them off into a number of regional companies that served the regions in which they were located. I think we can argue about whether that was a good idea or not, but as a regulatory action, it certainly worked. I think the other lever that I'm aware of, I'm not an expert in this area, so people can correct me if I'm wrong, is when the government's, the Justice Department stands in the way of or has to approve mergers of different media companies, right? So some are approved, some aren't, right? So the good example of this would be the Comcast Universal merger that occurred about a decade ago. There's one, Time Warner and somebody is trying to merge or something like that. And I just can't remember whether I went through or not. So those kinds of prospective moves can sort of prevent it from happening, before the fact, I guess. But it just seems like in terms of feasibility, that's kind of where we are. Once they happen, I'm trying to think of a historical precedent of where it has been. So not a sort of an infrastructure thing like AT&T, but a sort of a media content company. What is the precedent in the United States for having that go in the opposite direction away from merger, but due to sort of disaggregation, and I can't think of an example of that.
Yeah, 6 major media companies, more and more consolidation. That was amazing. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you again to our panelists. Mike,